So we're going to talk a little bit about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his response to the Depression. This is a picture of Roosevelt. Well, in 1932, let me try to get my handwriting a little bit better here. The Republicans nominated Herbert Hoover, who we had talked about in the last lecture. And the Democrats um, nominated Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, FDR was related to Teddy Roosevelt or Theodore Roosevelt, and we talked about him in some previous lectures. They were distant cousins, but they had a lot in common. They were both wealthy New Yorkers, both graduated from Harvard. Um, Franklin Delano Roosevelt also attended Columbia Law School and served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson. Um, and so he, had a lot in common with Teddy Roosevelt. Um, Unlike Teddy Roosevelt, FDR was tactful, suave, and conciliatory. Teddy Roosevelt, he would just tell you exactly what he thought, even if it offended you. And and because we're from, I guess, Louisiana or whatever, we kind of like that in people. But nonetheless, in politics and in governance, let's not even say politics, let's just talk about governance. You need to be a little more tactful sometimes because you don't want to offend people because, they may have certain skills that you need in order to run an organization or a country or whatever. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt was much more kind of suave, you might say. In 1920, now he was an aristocrat. So, in other words, if you went to an event with Roosevelt, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it would be highly unlikely that you would drink Mad Dog 2020 Boone's Farm. Okay? So, us, or at least me, I wouldn't mind that. However, Roosevelt was, Franklin Roosevelt was not the kind of guy that you would cook a sauce with and chase it down with Boone's Farm. All right. However, many kind of aristocratic type people were super snobby back then, and but Franklin Roosevelt wasn't that way. Okay, in 1921, he contracted polio, and this you might say the struggle with the disease, um, I guess, made him lose the sort of aristocratic arrogance, and he learned patience and compassion, uh, determination, and courage. Roosevelt once remarked that after trying for 2 years to wiggle one big toe, everything else seemed easy. Roosevelt was blessed with a golden speaking voice and a commanding presence. Um, One would wonder, I mean, I guess he was very similar to John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan in that sense. To some extent, even Barack Obama, whether you like President Obama or not, he has a very good speaking style. In fact, he even gets criticized for that because they say that he's a great speaker and orator, and some people say you have to be careful with people that are that way because they can steer very easily the country and maybe a direction that some people don't want. And the people that do agree with him, however, think it's a great thing. And that's the same thing with Roosevelt. He was kind of confronted with some of the same criticisms. Now, One of the things that we didn't talk about a whole lot was prohibition of alcohol, which of course was a total disaster in South Louisiana. It was quite a joke, in fact, as it was in many other places. And the Democratic platform came out even more strongly for the repeal of prohibition because they thought that it would help the economy, just like some people say that repealing the prohibition on marijuana would help the economy. They actually asked President Obama about that one time, and he said that he didn't think that it would help if we tried to smoke our way out of a recession, which is one of the kind of funny things I thought he said one time. And of course, this platform helped Roosevelt get elected. And Roosevelt did get elected. Now, what did Roosevelt do? Well, he tried to restore, number one, restore confidence. And, excuse me, he argued that government must wage war on the Depression as it would on an armed foe. He declared, quote, "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Okay, maybe it wasn't quite that way, but anyway. By then, 80% of the banks had been closed by state action. Roosevelt permitted the sounder banks to reopen under a license from the Treasury, and Roosevelt masterfully delivered a series of fireside chats on the radio to try to do this very thing. Okay? The so-called first 100 days of Roosevelt's administration were incredibly frantic. So serious was the emergency that the new Democratic Congress rubber-stamped all of his legislation. Roosevelt was a pragmatic, I guess, experimenter, you might say. What are some of the things that they did? They passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and I'm just going to go through a few of these, which created the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which paid farmers to reduce their acreage in order to lower the supply of their crops, thereby raising their price. The payments to farmers would not come from a progressive income tax, but from a tax on the consumer. Processors of farm products such as flour, millers would be taxed and would pass the tax on to the consumer. The AAA got off to a bad start, and much of the 1933 crop that had already been planted, it had to be plowed under. At the same time, over 6 million pigs were slaughtered. One guy said that they were cut down before they could reach the full hogness of their hogdom, whatever that meant. And such actions taken at a time when people were hungry struck many shocked observers as a senseless waste of food. These critics included the novelist John Steinbeck, who vividly immortalized the policy in The Grapes of Wrath. But the policy, to some extent, did work. It caused prices to rise, which in turn helped increase farm income. I mean, I could go on and on about the AAA. I'm not going to get into it too much, because each one of these policies, there's a lot of debate on whether they were good or not. Okay. Something else was the National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NRA. It created the National Recovery Administration, an agency modeled after the War Industry Board, which had successfully planned the American economy during World War I. And businesses were urged to join the NRA, and to join a business had to adopt a code of fair competition under which work hours would be reduced to maximize a 40-hour work week. So in other words, if you have one person working 80 hours a week, if you say, well, 40 hours a week, then at least two people get get to work. Okay, so that's kind of one concept that you might find in there. Something else was, and this is something that you may have heard your great grandparents talking about or your grandparents talking about, is the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was the most popular of all New Deal, and this is what a lot of these policies collectively were called by Roosevelt and others, and by historians today, the New Deal. And so the Civilian Conservation Corps provided work for about 3 million young single men aged 18 to 25 who lived in an open air camp and wore uniforms and lived like soldiers. In fact, my grandfather from Oberlin met my grandmother at a CCC camp, and they had three children. They got married, had three children, one of whom was my mama, and one day she married my father, and then eventually I came to be. All right. And now I'm talking to a computer. All right. Something else that was created at this time that you've probably heard of before was the FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which basically, and still does today, it insures your money up to a certain amount in a bank. In case the bank closes, all right, then your money is insured up to a certain amount. Originally, it was like 5,000. Later on, it went up. Like I think when I was in high school in the 80s, it was 100,000. I think today, I'm not even sure if it's 200,000 or 250,000. I never quite got that far to worry about it in my own finances. But in fact, if you know, let me know. All right, send me an email. It'd be easy to find out. I'll give you some extra points. All right, and so these are I just want to throw a few of these things out that Roosevelt did very early on. He did some other things like spent a lot of money on the Tennessee Valley Authority, which transformed about 41,000-mile territory um, into, I guess, a more modern area. This was like areas in Kentucky and Tennessee and Virginia and Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. It employed thousands of people. It operated utility plants, which produced a lot of cheap hydroelectric power, things like that, and kind of started moving these areas into what you would think of as a more modern, um, um, I guess a more modern society. Okay. Um, Also, the prohibition was repealed, and probably some people would say that was the most important thing Roosevelt did. He oversaw the repeal of prohibition through the passage and ratification of the 21st Amendment. Now, that's interesting. He had to pass an amendment to repeal prohibition because prohibition was an amendment to the Constitution. I mean, it was not just a law; it was in the Constitution. That's just amazing to me. But anyway, um, on the grounds that legalization of alcohol would raise federal revenues, lower expenses for enforcement, and provide employment for people, like, obviously making beer. When congressmen became excited as the time came for repealing prohibition, they began beating on their desk and chanting, "We want beer! We want beer!" And I will end that lecture with that.